Welcome to the second unit in our study of eugenics as social policy. Now this is going to be a tough unit. I'm going to walk you down history, social science, some philosophy of war and so forth, so that you get more than just a factual history on eugenics, but you get a context that stimulates interest in eugenics, and then you'll see some of what happens when you get a wholesale buy into a eugenics mentality and where it took us all the way into Nazi Germany. And we're going to talk about some logical outcomes. This is going to be tough. This is going to be where I really am going to be looking for you to learn the material, because I think if you get this foundation down, you're going to be much more valuable in any bioethical discussions down the road. Now there are many ways to describe the history of societies. Some are defined by social structures, others are defined by technological or industrial progress. I prefer to think of societies essentially, and perhaps more simplistically, as migrating from a survival emphasis to a competitive emphasis. A survival emphasis is where families take possession of a plot of ground. They hunt and harvest the natural animals and plants that are found on it, and then they begin to plant and grow crops and have grazing going on in the fields. The emphasis is on survival. Hunt, harvest, and grow enough for the survival of the family, and also to barter if you're going to purchase things that you can't grow or maintain on your property. Now, in these early years, farmers were often helping their neighbors on big tasks, with everyone sharing the common goal of surviving. So we've got the barn raisings. We've got a farmer gets hurt and people help him harvest his fields and so forth. They wanted enough food on the table and a warm home to be safe in, and so that created a different attitude with regards to eugenics. Now this survival phase of history was strongly agrarian in nature, very farm-oriented. Families were large and everyone had a task to keep that family farm working. And so for many years the prevailing notion was that bigger is better. A larger family meant the ability to get more farming tasks done, perhaps handle larger farms, and produce more. All that changed in 1798 when Reverend Thomas Malthus challenged the prevailing notion that more children was better for the world and for the population. In what has been called either the Malthusian theory or the Malthusian catastrophe, Malthus proposed that population growth eventually outweighs available resources, and that if you give it enough time, nature or divine intervention brings populations into balance with available resources. Now, the most common criticism against Malthus is that in his calculations he failed to consider the technological advances which would improve the raising of livestock and provide a substantial increase in crop production per acre of land. But in theory there was logic to what Malthus was saying, and it has a profound effect on the social policy and social thought in the years that were to come. Okay, a little politics here, British politics. William Pitt the Younger became the youngest prime minister ever in Great Britain when he was elected in 1783. Plagued by poor health, he left the office in 1801. Americans became more familiar with Pitt as the prime minister friend of William Wilberforce in the film Amazing Grace, which, by the way, just a quick commercial, an outstanding film to talk about abolition of slavery in Great Britain. Very well done. It's a great film. In the earlier portion of 1798, William Pitt introduced new poor laws for Great Britain, in which he encouraged larger families as a means by which the plight of the poor might be eased by the assistance of family members. And then with the coming of the Malthus paper, Pitt's reforms were fought, and the new emphasis was placed in Great Britain on discouraging poverty by making poverty more uncomfortable, making the poorhouses less desirable. Now, over the next 50 years, the writings of three men would profoundly affect societal attitudes towards the poor. Thomas Malthus, in his essay on population in 1897, had the first and arguably the greatest influence. Because of his writings, families in the poorhouses were split up to discourage them from procreating. David Ricardo popularized the idea of free trade, and specifically the strong role of centralized government, and that real wages tend towards a minimum level that is sufficient for survival. So some claim that that Ricardo laid the foundation for what became Marxism, but it had a profound effect in British politics and social policy. And the third person was a kind of an odd duck guy named Jeremy Bentham. He popularized the idea of utilitarianism, which is that the most moral or ethical things to do is what would bring happiness to the greatest number of people. He advocated laws which to discourage what hurts society as a whole and encourage those laws which help society. He really was a different guy. After he died, he always believed in public dissection. So he actually, as he was nearing death, scheduled a public dissection of his own body, and his skeletal remains are clothed, and then they created a wax head, and he's basically in a glass box in a British college, and they used to have his actual head that they thought was preserved well, but it got rather grotesque, sitting on the ground between his feet, and they had a wax head on the shoulders, and the students kept stealing the head, and so they had to kind of secure that away. So very much of an odd duck, but he popularized the idea of utilitarianism. Everything has to serve a purpose, and it's always the good of the many outweigh the good of the few. That's very strong Bentham philosophy. Now, it was the influences of Malthus and Ricardo and Bentham that made a very direct impact on social British culture. The Malthus criticism of the poor laws directly challenged reforms proposed by William Pitt, and for decades Britain adopted a nearly hostile approach to the impoverished. In 1834, there were new poor laws that made care for the impoverished even more harsh and more cruel, which gave Charles Dickens a common theme throughout his most famous writings. For example, in A Christmas Carol, Dickens records a pre-Christmas encounter between Ebenezer Scrooge and two portly gentlemen raising money for the poor over the holiday. Upon meeting Ebenezer Scrooge, the men are greeted with a cruel retort as Scrooge asks, "Are there no prisons? And the union workhouses? And are the treadmill and poor law in full vigor?" And the final punch is when Scrooge is told that the poor would rather die than to go into those poorhouses. And Scrooge responds, "If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Now, in all of this dialogue, Dickens was making a social commentary characterizing his own objections to the poor law regulations, which were decidedly harsh against the poor. Now, I want you to consider this timeline for a moment, because you can see how the environment or the tracks are being laid for contemporary eugenics. Jeremy Bentham, who was primarily a philosopher, publicly published, quote, "An Introduction to Morals and Legislation, in 1789, in which his theories of utilitarianism were first introduced, which included the notion that people lean towards pleasure, and as it applied to the poor, people would be more inclined to take relief than to take work. Now think about that point. Bentham argued that if you made the life of the poor easy, they're going to be more inclined to stay poor. There's going to be no incentive for them to work harder, because he said it's our natural nature to go towards pleasure. Now, though he published in 1789, Bentham's theories did not begin to gain traction until after Thomas Malthus, who as a clergyman had some credibility, and he was a recognized economist, published his paper, An Essay on the Principle of Population, in 1798. That paper led to the practice of breaking up poor families so they would not reproduce. And that literally was a strategy in Great Britain. If you had a poor family living together in a poorhouse, the last thing the Britons want was them getting together sexually and populating, so they would split the families up so husbands and wives were not together in order to procreate. Then in 1817, David Ricardo, who was an economist, he wrote The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which reflects what is now called the iron law of wages. And it's the idea that wages always level off to a subsistence level, in other words, just to get by, which means that the more poor, the lower the level will be. So then in 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed, which substantially cut funding to the care for the poor, led to the creation of workhouses, and opened the door for substantial abuse of the poor. Charles Dickens, started writing as a social commentary on the treatment of the poor from 1836 to 1861, and then in 1859, Charles Darwin brought evolutionary thinking to the forefront when he published his Origin of Species. All of this history and social development in Britain brings us to a fellow by the name of Sir Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics and laid the top coat to the foundation of utilitarian eugenics that was being laid since the beginning of the 19th century in Britain. Sir Francis Galton is the fellow who coined the term eugenics and began writings on that topic after being profoundly influenced by the work of Charles Darwin, who was his second cousin or part cousin or one of those removed cousins, and I'll show you that in a moment. A few things on Francis Galton. Francis Galton was just an odd duck in many ways. The family was independently wealthy, so he never really had to hold down a real world job. He wanted to be an explorer for Britain and seemed to have trouble finding a niche for that. But he eventually got onto a ship, and there's some small segments of land in Africa that were credited to Galton for discovery. But he had different theories about where do better-looking women live. He created a thing that he put on his thumb that had like a little thumbnail on it. And what he would do is he would take a square piece of paper and he would remember where each corner was, and then he would have this in his pocket, and he would sit on street corners in large European cities and gauge all the women he would see, and it caused him to conclude that the most beautiful women in all the world were in Paris, France. But he also had the idea that baldness was the sign of excessive genius, and so he had actually created for himself a top hat with a bladder that you squeeze, and it would open it up to let the hot air off that would gather in the top of the top hat, because he was thinking so hard. So a little bit different. And Francis Galton, you're kind of affected by him every day. He was the one who developed weather maps. Basically kind of the crude pattern that today is our weather map showing wind direction and so forth. He also, and it's been pretty controversial, it looks like he stole the concept of fingerprinting and gave that to Scotland Yard as a way to stay on top of prisoners and identifying them. So somewhat of a Renaissance man, and just a very different person personally. Now, as I said, he's related. There's a relation here. Let's start off by looking at Erasmus Darwin. Okay, Erasmus Darwin is the grandfather both to Charles Darwin and to Francis Galton. Now, if you look over on the left, Josiah Wedgwood, this is the guy that Wedgwood china, anybody who's into fine Great Britain china, Josiah Wedgwood is the one who created the pottery studio for Wedgwood, what is today Wedgwood China. And Josiah was very heavily in the fight against slavery in Great Britain, and he manufactured pendants, which said, I'm trying to get these all out there. See that there? Am I not a man and a brother? And he distributed those throughout the area. Now, Erasmus Darwin was he was a botanist, and he was an authority on the natural sciences. He was a philosopher, and he was the personal physician to the King of England. Now, Erasmus Darwin also supported the abolition of slavery. And then, as you can see from the chart, Josiah Wedgwood's daughter, Susanna, married Robert Darwin, the son of Erasmus, and one of their sons was Charles Darwin. And on the right side of the chart, you'll see that the daughter of Erasmus Darwin, Frances, married a fellow by the name of Samuel Galton, and they had a son with the name Francis Galton. That makes Charles Darwin and Francis Galton related in that they have the same grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. I think that makes them half-cousins, or perhaps second cousins. The terminology gets pretty confusing for me, but what is clear is that they were relatives, they knew each other well, they shared resources and notes and so forth over the years. Francis Galton's interest in eugenics got its impetus when Charles Darwin shared with him a draft of his book, Origin of Species. Galton had a particular interest in whether human ability was in any way hereditary. In 1883, he coined the term eugenics in his book entitled Inquiries into Human Faculty and Development. In that book, he advocated as social policy the encouragement of couples of high rank to marry and procreate among themselves. For the most part, Galton focused on the encouragement of healthy individuals to procreate. Society was going to then take these concepts and run with them. Now, during this same time, issues were occurring in the United States, making it ripe to adopt eugenics mentality. Even prior to its independence, the United States was wrestling with how to handle the mental and physically infirmed. In colonial times, those so inflicted were often locked away in foul-smelling and dirty cells like prisoners, or perhaps even more correctly, like animals. They were often treated like livestock. It wasn't until 1817 that the Quakers opened the first moral treatment asylum in America. By 1841, that number had grown to 16 such asylums. Now, let's go back into Great Britain for a moment here. We're going to be bouncing back and forth now. Remember that Thomas Malthus's paper was released in 1798. And that when that paper was released, the poor laws that were splitting up families to restrict their ability to procreate. In other words, the papers directly led to them saying, we just got to keep people from having babies if they can't afford it. So in 1882, back in the United States, the Pennsylvanian gynecologist named William Goodell proposed castrating the mentally insane to prevent them from procreating. The 1883 release of Francis Galton's book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, certainly made Goodell's suggestion more palatable to the public. If social order could be encouraging the healthy to procreate, then perhaps social order can discourage the infirm from procreating. That is where Connecticut comes in. Now, Connecticut was the first state in the world to have a constitution. Ironically, when the new constitution was written and adopted in 1781, Connecticut was the last state to approve it, but that's kind of a long story. Connecticut has got a really crazy story about how they got things going. North Dakota was not that far behind Connecticut with the rule in 1896. Connecticut adopted a rule that it made it illegal for the insane to get married. North Dakota followed suit, and then Michigan. And in Michigan, they actually said, this is, again, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it said that you would face a $1,000 fine and 5 years in prison if you violate the insane law. By 1914, more than 20 states had similar laws, and by 1933, it appears no states permitted the insane to marry. Now, in 1907, things got physical, when the state of Indiana became the first state to legalize the mandatory sterilization of the infirm. And then other states were to follow, and this was all going to culminate, this is 1907, in about 20 years, this is going to culminate in a Supreme Court ruling. So that's the direction we're going. This was a tough time, or this was not a tough time, this was an incredible time of significant social change in the United States. The Industrial Revolution was closing in on being a century old in the U.S. The late 1800s brought the electrification of the United States with the work of Thomas Edison on the light bulb, and on establishing, Edison also established the electrical power distribution system, which brought profound changes in the United States. In 1913, Henry Ford introduced assembly line construction to the blossoming automotive industry, which gave birth to a growing middle class. The First World War ran from 1914 to 1918. The women's suffrage movement began in the middle of the 1800s, but became a national effort in 1920. In 1916, Margaret Sanger opened her first birth control clinic. Prohibition went into effect from 1920 to 1933, which created an incredibly sophisticated underground network of organized crime to help people get their liquor. All of these and a host of other cultural developments formed a new social landscape that generated interest and excitement into eugenics. Now, in many ways, eugenics promised resolution to some of society's most baffling issues. Anything less than normal that is passed on by procreation can be addressed by some sort of eugenics program. The wealthy in America bankrolled much of the 3 international eugenics conferences that were held. The first was in 1912, and that one was held in London. The second conference was held in 1921, and that was held in New York. And the third conference was held in 1932, and that was also held in New York. Now, the first conference, the first eugenics conference, was dedicated to Francis Galton, who had died the previous year. The conference was held in London, and as a British affair, there were it was heavily, Britain being represented there. And among the luminaries in attendance was Winston Churchill. Now, at the time, Churchill was a member of Parliament, and 2 years after the conference, in 1913, he was going to help draft what is called the Mental Deficiency Act. And the Mental Deficiency Act set out to define various levels of mental deficiency and then to establish institutions or colonies for their care. Now, there were only 3 opposing votes to legalizing that act. Ironically, one of those who spoke in opposition was Josiah Wedgwood, the great-great-grandson of the Josiah Wedgwood who was Charles Darwin's grandfather on his mother's side. In his objection, he said, "It is a spirit of the horrible eugenic society which is setting out to breed up the working class as though they were cattle." Now, the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 stayed in effect in England until 1959. Also, the predominant American presence was a display that was set up by a group called the American Breeders Association, which displayed what Wikipedia called the incidence of hereditary defects in human pedigrees. The American Breeders Association was founded in 1903. In 1915, it changed its name to the American Genetic Association and renamed its publication the Journal of Heredity. Now, the second International Eugenics Conference was held in New York. Though it was predominantly an American event, with 41 of the 53 papers were presented by Americans, it maintained its ties with Great Britain. The conference was presided over by Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was president of the American Museum of Natural History. Alexander Graham Bell, who is credited with inventing the first practical telephone, was born in Scotland and a known advocate of eugenics. He was named honorary chairman of the conference. By the way, he died the following year. And listed as the major guest speaker was Major Leonard Darwin. He was the 8th child of Charles Darwin and the fellow who succeeded Francis Galton in 1911 as the head of the British Eugenics Society. He spoke at the first eugenics conference, and at this conference he advocated the need to eliminate the unfit, the need to discourage the ill-endowed, and from having large families, and framed all of this as a practical application of the evolutionary principles that were popularized by his father. So evolution has a real strong play in eugenics philosophy, both abroad and in the United States. The mandatory sterilization of the infirm did not occur without its legal challenges. This brings us to the case of Carrie Buck. There have been volumes written about the case of Carrie Buck that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Wikipedia page on Carrie Buck will help you get a lot of information on the case. Also, you can visit, so under Wikipedia, look up Carrie Buck. But you can also go to buckvbell.com. That's B-U-C-K-V as in verses, B-E-L-L. buckvbell.com for additional information. Now on the right there, you see I added the picture of Doris Figgins as an example of how wild the sterilization program got. Doris went into the hospital, and Doris, by the way, is the half-sister of Carrie Buck. Doris went into the hospital for an appendectomy and was sterilized without her knowledge or consent. She found out in 1980, after many frustrating years, of trying to have children. And I believe she died 1 year prior to Carrie. I think she died in 1982. So the year was 1927, and the case of Buck versus Bell was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court. In an 8-1 ruling, the justices found that the Virginia sterilization statutes adequately protected the rights of those forcibly sterilized. The Chief Justice for this court is former U.S. President William Howard Taft. You'll see him sitting there in the front row right in the middle. The court also consisted of noted scholar Louis Brandeis. He's in the back row, second from the left. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, he's the one that's in the out picture on the right, who wrote for the court majority. In his majority opinion, Holmes wrote, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Now, those words, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, are seen particularly as offensive today, but in the 1920s, imbecile was actually one of the classifications of the infirm, and it was different than idiocy and so forth. But what was really crazy about this whole case is that after it was all done, the court, or after the court had ruled and everything, it found out that this case was fixed from the start. That Carrie Buck was not mentally an imbecile. She was not mentally slow. And when the child she gave birth to was a normal functioning student, BC student, who died of a blood disorder around 8 years old. But what ended up happening here is that the foster parents who were watching over Carrie while her mother was in an asylum, it was I believe it was their nephew that had raped Carrie, and they sought to protect the family name by claiming that Carrie was being promiscuous. And so it was an ugly affair all the way around. But following the Supreme Court ruling, Carrie Buck was forcibly sterilized so that she could not have any more children. Also, as an aside on all this as well, she ended up growing up and I think dying in 1983. I know she had I believe she had 2 husbands that she outlived. She helped take care of both of them. Deeds that could not have been done by someone who was considered to be mentally slow. She did say in an interview in the early 80s how much she regretted not being able to have any more children after her first daughter had died. So it was a pretty shabby ruling from actually a pretty gifted Supreme Court. By the time we get to the 3rd International Eugenics Conference, a number of wealthy Americans were heavily funding eugenic research in America. This 3rd Eugenics Conference was dedicated to Mary Williamson Harriman. She was the widow of railroad executive E.H. Harriman and a primary funder for the conference and eugenics research. Now, she would die later that year, so this was in her last year of life. The conference was presided over by Charles Davenport, who is perhaps the primary eugenics advocate in the United States at that time. Now, also at this time, Major Leonard Darwin was 88 years old, and he was too old to attend the conference, but he sent a report to be read, and in the report that he sent, he predicted that eugenic measures must be implemented, or otherwise civilization would face impending doom. Okay, now we get into some uncomfortable connections. As stated earlier, the early eugenics movement in America was heavily funded by America's wealthiest and most influential people. Much of the research took place at centers and universities where genetics and eugenics were primary areas of research. One such institution was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics that was founded in 1927 in Berlin, Germany. The building, which I have a picture here of, and much of the program was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which was founded by John D. Rockefeller and his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who were both alive when the building was erected, and they funded much of its operation during the Depression years in the United States just to keep it going. During those years, Dr. Joseph Mengele worked as an understudy to Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, who was the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Mengele was later to be the chief physician at the Auschwitz concentration camp, known for his grisly eugenic experiments on the prisoners in that camp. Simply put, American dollars helped give Mengele an understanding of eugenics. Now, in America, supporting eugenics was fashionable. Charles Lindbergh was one of many high-profile supporters of a eugenics mindset. He developed a close friendship with Dr. Alexis Carrel, who had won the 1912 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work in closing or stitching blood vessels and his pioneering research into organ transplantation, including some experiments with head transplantation, not human heads. I guess Germany actually played around with that later, but he used animal heads. In the 1930s, the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh sought out Dr. Carrel's help in the hope of finding help for his sister-in-law, who had a serious heart ailment caught on by a bout of rheumatic fever. Carrel had been developing a perfusion pump, which became a critical instrument to help in organ transplants and heart surgery. Lindbergh saw the pump, was disappointed at it because it was so crude, and used his ability as a machinist and so forth to refine the pump, and so both are considered the inventors of it, and it earned them a place in the 1938 cover of Time magazine. Both Carrel and Lindbergh were avid supporters of eugenics. Such advocacy was deemed to support what we call positive eugenics, which is the idea where people are supposed to be making conscientious, self-directed decisions themselves about, well, okay, we're healthy, we should be breeding, we're not healthy, we should not be breeding. And they were not, there's no evidence that they were in favor of terminating life or anything. These are the things that are going to be coming in that next logical step of what happened in Nazi Germany. Now, in 1935, there was an editorial from the New York Times that pretty much opened up the prevailing eugenics mentality of the era. The writer stated this: "Modern philanthropy, working hand in hand with modern medical science, is preserving many strains which in all preceding ages would have been inexorably eliminated. While life has become easier in the lower ranges, it has become more difficult for the well-born and the educated, who pay for modern philanthropy in an ever-lessening ability to afford children of their own. There is a very serious question whether the 20th century will be able to maintain and pass onward the infinitely intricate and specialized structure of civilization created by the 19th century." Now, essentially, the author's point is that the wealthy were having trouble supporting themselves and having children because they were spending too much money taking care of the burdens of society who are from the lower ranges. It was a pretty look down your nose view on people, but that's the way people were thinking. That's the way that they were talking at that time. Okay, now we get to Nazi Germany. I have always felt that the holy grail in understanding where bioethics is going is to understand how Germany got to where it was under Nazi rule, because you can watch that you're not repeating historical patterns and mistakes. Now, it's a complicated study of history and economics, war philosophy, and human psychology. The German nation did not all of a sudden turn brutal and heartless. There was a culture that had been brewing for decades, if not centuries, that catapulted the German nation into what became one of the most ruthless reigns of terror known in human history. In case you haven't figured it out yet, I could devote an entire course to studying eugenics and how it manifested itself in Nazi Germany. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover it all here, but I do need to give you a brief overview, because as you see what happened in Germany regarding eugenics, you're going to see signs of it in what's happening today in the pursuits of bioethics and in biotechnology. Scripture teaches us that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Such was the case in Germany. Having lost World War I, the German nation faced staggering war reparation penalties. Following the defeat of Germany in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles required substantial land concessions by Germany and massive war reparations, to the tune of 132 billion marks, which in 2015 is equivalent to nearly $77 billion. In 1918, the German population was estimated at around 64 million people, which means the cost of reparations were about $1.2 million for every man, every woman, and every child in Germany. This created incredible resentment and a crushing financial condition for Germany. And of course, that was France was primarily behind pushing the very steep war reparations because they wanted to keep Germany bankrupt so that they never do this again. Now, the loss of the war was a humiliating defeat, and the political climate in Germany was ripe for a strong stand of nationalism and a solution for a crushing financial problem, not to mention looking for scapegoats for all of the hardship that had come their way. In 1925 and 1926, Adolf Hitler, who had already begun activity in what would become the Nazi Party, was imprisoned as a political activist and antagonist, and there he wrote what is called his autobiographical manifesto in 2 volumes, and it was called Mein Kampf, which simply translated means my struggle. Now, what's interesting, his working title for the book was 4.5 Years of Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity, and Cowardice. I guess he chose to leave the editorializing for the content and go with a simple title. But like any structured campaign, Hitler presented a vision which addressed many issues that were gnawing at the general German population. He had scapegoats for their current problems, and he had solutions. His plan was simple. We need to reduce expenses. We need to increase income. We need to settle the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. We need to restore national pride and get rid of the people who get in the way. Central to his doctrine was to ride the international wave in support of eugenics. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, abbreviated as the Nazi Party, was founded in 1920, which is 5 years before Hitler went into jail. It was founded by combining a few other groups that were strongly nationalistic, very anti-Semitic, and very much opposed to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The founder was a fellow by the name of Anton Drexler. But in 1921, Hitler had gotten involved. He got involved in 1920 already, but 1921 he was out doing fundraising. He was just became a very popular, recognizable figure, of very strong influence, and he became head of the party. And after his imprisonment in 1925 and 1926, he published Mein Kampf, and he rose to prominence. And eventually, when the Nazi Party got representation in the German legislature, he was named Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Less than 6 months later, on July 14th, 1933, the Nazi government issued what is called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, which required physicians to report every case of hereditary disease. Now, the first provision of the law stated this: any person suffering from a hereditary disease may be rendered incapable of procreation by means of a surgical operation, sterilization, if the experience of medical science shows that it is highly probable that his descendants would suffer from some serious physical or mental hereditary defect. Now, the second provision listed conditions that warranted sterilization, and they included the following: congenital mental deficiency, schizophrenia, manic depressive insanity, hereditary epilepsy, hereditary chorea, which is Huntington's disease, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, any severe hereditary deformity. And then the third provision of the law added that severe alcoholism also warranted sterilization. The Nazi government pointed to the particular success that was occurring in the United States, and especially in the state of California, that had instituted these sterilization laws. And that's how they justified this as being a good thing. And it's interesting because if you do some reading, how the church wrestled with this, because the members of the church had really been sucked into the mentality that eugenics was good for everybody. It was thoughtful, it was considerate, and okay, maybe it had to be forced, but a lot of these people didn't know better, so you got to cover for them like a parent does for a child. Now, if you read the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Bonhoeffer was very alarmed over the direction that he saw the Nazi government going, but it always fell on deaf ears, and it just wasn't going anyplace. In fact, I'll add here, I didn't have it in my notes, but I'll add it here. It's interesting when you read the biographical accounts on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and also on Winston Churchill. There's an interesting political thing that was going on. Bonhoeffer wanted a meeting with Churchill to tell him that things are not all good in Germany, that there's an undercurrent of people that did not like what was going on in Germany. These laws were not good, and even though some of the church were saying, well, we must respect Caesar, the church was turning a blind eye to a lot of these injustices going on. Churchill consistently turned down the meetings. And when you read Churchill's biographies, they'll say that he justified refusing to meet with the people from Germany because he was trying to sell the British public that we need to be unified in our fight against the German enemy. And it was much more difficult to unify the British people in this fight if you're going to turn around and say, well, Germany's the enemy, but not all of Germany, because there are some good people there. The moment you couldn't keep it on simple terms, he felt that they were going to weaken their resolve. It was a very interesting dilemma, but it had disastrous consequences. So just as you're beginning to kind of trace things, the United States was training Mengele, who would end up being a major driver behind the gruesome eugenics experiments, and then Churchill was trying to keep the British people unified in its resolve against Germany, and as a result, on a daily basis, thousands of people were being killed in Germany under their eugenic practices. Now, over a 12-year period, it is estimated that more than 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized under the sterilization law in Germany. Eventually, the Nazi government used these gray buses, like the one pictured there, to gather up the useless eaters, the people who were a burden on society, and they were shipped to 6 so-called medical centers. These are not the concentration camps, that's different. These are the medical centers in which the infirm and the undesired were basically left to starve to death. And then after they would starve to death, the families would get a letter from the government saying, we regret to inform you that your loved one became sick and died, and so we have cremated the bodies and disposed of the remains. And that's how it was going on. This is what is called negative eugenics, where you're not only forcibly trying to purify the race through sterilization, you are now terminating people who will get in the way and become a burden on society. As forcible sterilization of the infirm and undesirables morphed into rounding them up to take them to centers where they were starved to death, the eugenics movement in Germany was moving into a new stage with the start of World War II. Now, World War II officially began on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. War and the need to preserve and reallocate resources became a new argument in the cause of actively pursuing a negative eugenics program. You need to get rid of the useless eaters. You need to get rid of the people who are getting in the way. You need to get rid of the people who are using up the resources. So on October 1st, 1939, Hitler issued a forced euthanasia program called Aktion T4. The order was backdated to September 1st, so that coincided with the invasion into Poland, and so that he could make a clear case that, we have to take harsher measures, stronger measures, because we're at war for the integrity of the German people. This was the mentality that was going on. Okay, the term T4 was an abbreviation for the address of the headquarters for the program. The headquarters was on Tiergartenstrasse 4, located in the Tiergarten district of central Berlin. And I got a picture there of the Tiergartenstrasse 4 building. That building has since been destroyed, and there's a memorial plaque there. But the decree simply read, Reich leader Buller and Dr. Medbrandt are charged with the responsibility of enlarging the competence of certain physicians designated by name, so that patients who, on the basis of human judgment, menschlichen Ermessen, are considered incurable, can be granted mercy death, Gnadentod, after a discerning diagnosis. It's an incredible, when you're reading this history, it's incredible how far along it came. By the end of this phase of the eugenics program, there had been an estimated 200,000 lives that had been lost. 200,000 lives where they had gathered up those, even their own German people who were injured in World War I or who had brain damage or lost limbs and so forth. 200,000 that were lost. And Germany was not finished yet, because now it's become the next great phase. Well, actually, there's 2 phases. The next phase here is going to be real weird. One of the things that happened is that German scientists were engaged in dangerous and non-consensual experimentation on prisoners of war for the most part, and those deemed already condemned to death. Those tests, many of which the test subject was not expected to survive, were often designed to further Germany's war efforts. And so they did some of these in the Holocaust on the Jewish people, but they started doing this with prisoners of war. They would sew shrapnel into wounds, pieces of wood and metal and things that would be like shrapnel if you were around an explosion. They would sew it in the wounds, and then they would cut open wounds and just leave them that way and let bacteria get into it, and to see if they could learn new ways to treat wounds in battle. And then they conducted tests, such as the cold water experiments, that was designed to judge how long it would take to find a German soldier if he was blown off of a ship and into the North Sea. And so they would be plunged into this ice cold water, and then they would time how long it would be until they passed out and or died, which, by the way, the figure was like around 70 minutes. Then there were the decompression tests, where they were brought up rapidly from depths to see how fast they can bring up soldiers from a submarine. And then there were other cold climate tests to test their endurance of soldiers that would be fighting on the Russian front. These were gruesome tests, these were cruel tests, and they were ultimately designed so that they would die in the end because they were considered expendable. And then, of course, we get to the end result of negative eugenics in Germany, and that was the horrifying spectacle of cruelty and abuse that was discovered in the Nazi concentration camps upon their liberation in 1945. An estimated 6 million Jews who were hated in German culture were exterminated by Germany's eugenics program. And just talking about them, I have volumes of books in my library that recalls their plight, the injustice, the splitting them up from families. My own mother was born in the Netherlands, and she was just a little girl in Amsterdam, and she recalls seeing the trains with the Jewish people packed into cars, crying and screaming because they had been separated from family and they were being taken away to their own death. And then the German army had taken specialized Jewish prisoners that would serve as basically additional soldiers who would befriend the people coming off the trains, telling them we got to clean you up, we're going to give you new clothes, take off your clothes, fold it up neatly, put them in the lockers, and we're going to put you into these showers. And those were Jewish people, these Jewish intermediaries, who would round them up, put them into these showers, so-called showers, and then they would gas them. And there's horrible stories of not all of them were gassed when they were buried alive afterwards. Some thrown into the furnaces where they look like they're still alive. Just terrible, terrible, terrible things. And then what Germany would do is every so often they would take these intermediate guards and they would take them out back and then shoot them, because they knew it was only a matter of time before they would turn on them, and then they would get new ones. So it was a horrible process that was going on. Okay, and this is the last slide on the eugenics program. But what makes all of this pertinent to our discussion on bioethics and biotechnology is that what was going on with the Nazi experiment, if we want to call it that, with eugenics, is that all they were doing was taking eugenics down its logical path. You've got people who are burdens, you've got people who carry their weight, you've got people who are dragging you down, you've got people who need to progress forward. You've got competitive societies from nation to nation, and you've got people who get in the way. So, you try to prevent them from procreating, and then you try to prevent them from getting in the way, so you institutionalize them, and then somebody starts crunching numbers and saying, boy, it sure costs an awful lot of money. So you create a mentality in society saying that if you fall in love with somebody who's infirm, you really owe it to society not to procreate. And if you are in love with somebody that is healthy and everything, you have a responsibility to society to procreate. And it's all of this logic that becomes embedded with eugenics, which much of it is going on today. Just look at the mentality behind assisted suicide. Not only is assisted suicide being talked about in the United States as people having the right to choose over their own bodies and so forth, what's really going on here is it creates a mentality. When you get to be a burden, you owe it to everybody else to get out of the way. And of course, as we can see now what's going on in the Netherlands and in Belgium, the assisted suicide mentality is already gone from volunteering for it to people who can't make a decision. So we just say, well, we would assume because of their malady or their condition, they wouldn't want to live like this, so we authorize their life to be ended. That's where it's going today. Now, what's interesting when you study the German eugenics program is there isn't a lot of effort being made to justify eugenics. You got to remember, the United States had been doing a grand job all by itself, and there were the 3 international eugenic conferences that were doing that as well. So all Germany was doing is saying, we're just carrying it out. What's some bizarre writings going on in Germany was that they couldn't figure out how to efficiently do this. How do you terminate thousands of lives efficiently? What do you do with the bodies? How do you get the lives to end, and what do you do with the bodies? And so they were burying them, and that wasn't working, and they were, gas chambers, but it took so slow, and took so long, and so you'll find all sorts of writings about how they were going to be able to do this. Now, people will sometimes say, well, how could they have been so cruel, and how could they have been so heartless? Well, what's interesting, and we don't have time to go in it here, but if you study the about a century's worth of literature leading up to the Nazis taking control in 1933, you'll find that there was this just growing hatred, distrust for the Jewish people, that if you're watching closely and reading a lot of the political stuff going on today, it's still there. It's still there. And but what they did is, by the time they got to the concentration camps, in the Nuremberg trials, many times they would say that they did not see the Jewish people as people. They saw them as another form of an animal. They had no problem torturing them. They had no problem killing them. They had no problem experimenting on them without anesthesia. None of that, because they just saw it as just a lab rat. And that's how it worked. So these are profound ethical issues that we've had already in our recent history, and it has a profound effect on our current bioethical and research and social trends. The challenge for a Christian on bioethical issues is to understand the nature of a sinful person, and how, left without restraint, left without guidelines, will wander deeper into the dark woods of cruelty and extermination that fails to show respect for God's gift of life. So this is I want to be able to talk about this with you, because when you understand what went wrong in Germany, you're going to be very alarmed to see the directions we're going, and how unwilling we are as a people to deal with the hard questions. Nobody wants to talk about where the logic leads, because they all just simply trust it'll work out okay. So that's the material we have for week 5. Like I said, I want you to put most of your time into studying this and being very good at it, and I promise I'll make the rest of the course a little bit easier.